Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk today about the escalation of the war in Vietnam. If you look at America's participation up to this point, it had happened during the Truman and then the Eisenhower and then the Kennedy administration. During Truman and Eisenhower, we were aiding the French in their fight against the Vietnamese who wanted their independence. During Eisenhower's administration in '54, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. There was a Geneva conference, and then it was divided between North and South. So then Eisenhower continues to lend his support financially and through giving aid to the people of South Vietnam and even advising them. And then Kennedy becomes president, and we start to get more involved. And then you saw that in the last section. Um, Now Diem Diem was a bad leader. He was deposed and he was killed. He was killed about the same time that Kennedy was killed. So today we're starting a whole new sort of chapter in America's war and fight in Vietnam. We start to escalate, and this really happens during Johnson's administration. And that's what this whole section is about. Okay, so the way that we were able to get involved in it, there really wasn't a formal declaration of war, but there was the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So Johnson, he was advised by the Secretary of State, Robert McNamara, that in order to defeat the communists in the north of Vietnam, we need to send more troops there. Well, the President of the United States can't just mamby-pamby send troops wherever he wants to send them. And so there was an incident that occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is off the coast of Vietnam, all of that beautiful coastline that they have there. So we had some ships kind of patrolling the area, but they happened to be destroyers. If there were destroyers along our coast of the United States, we would probably bomb them. But anyway, it was the USS Maddox. It was reported that it was fired upon while it was patrolling the waters off the coast of Vietnam. Come to find out, through work done by Daniel Ellsberg, who we're going to talk about later, and some historians who have dug into this, that most likely never occurred. So anyway, Americans get all riled up because our warship, our destroyer, was fired upon by communists in North Vietnam. Keep in mind, this is during the Cold War, right? So in Congress, there's this resolution, and what it says is the President of the United States can take all necessary powers to repel any attack against the forces of the United States. So in Congress, there were two people in the House. They voted 88-2 in opposition to this, but it was overwhelmingly supported to be able to do whatever. Johnson can do whatever he wanted to go to war. And what he's going to do, he's going to initiate a draft. He's going to do an air campaign. We're going to get ground troops on the ground in Vietnam, and it's going to be all-out war. So because Johnson can do whatever he needed to do to fight off all forces, what he did is we need to increase the number of people in our military, so he initiated a draft. Now, there haven't been that many drafts in our nation's history. Civil War was the first one, World War I, World War II, Korea, and then Vietnam. So anyway, they initiated a draft, and it's by a lottery. It's basically who gets drawn, right? Some people what they did is they went ahead and they enlisted either in the Navy or the new Air Force at that time. A lot of people did not want to be in the Army. But anyway, it was a lottery. Some people, though, they can get deferred. You can get deferred for medical reasons. You could get deferred if you were in school. You could get deferred if you were the head of the household. If you're the only male child. Mostly, though, people got deferred for health reasons or if they were in college, right? 1/3 of them for that reason. So if you look over here, though, 2 million people served in uniform in Vietnam, and most of them volunteered. We had a mostly volunteer army. I know that my dad served in Vietnam, and he was a career man. He had served in Korea and Vietnam, and he didn't like people who were drafted because they didn't want to fight and they weren't professional soldiers, right? So for him, that was problematic because they just had a really bad attitude. So 25 people were deferred for health reasons, and then 30% were deferred for non-health reasons, and most of those people were college students. And as we know, many college students come from wealthier families. So there seemed to be a higher percentage of combat soldiers who were African Americans or other people who were poor. So African Americans made up 24% of the war casualties, right? But they only made up 11% of the population. Now, there might be some other variables at play here because if you look at when you're in the military, there are a lot of different jobs you can do. You don't have to be in the infantry. You don't have to be on the front lines. So maybe some of them, maybe they didn't have the educational background to get other jobs or that sort of thing. There could be a lot of socioeconomic aspects of this, right? So it's not just we're just going to put black people in combat units and not in supply or not in this or not in that. Um, it's hard to say. I haven't seen all the data on this, and I think that you could probably ferret it out if you investigated. But anyway, so a lot of people served in non-combat positions. That's most Americans, and that's true of any war. I served in a non-combat position in administration, even though there was no real war. It was just the Cold War. So communications, engineering, medical, transportation, any of those, right? A lot of the people who served, 10,000 were women, mostly as nurses, admin, supply, those sorts of things. More and more women were serving in the military. I know when I joined the military, it was just like 8 years after we had left Vietnam, and there were a lot of women in. But there were a lot more than normal. But when I was in there, the numbers were still pretty low. All right, if you look, between 20,000 and 45,000 more women worked in civilian roles and in the Red Crosses in humanitarian roles. So, as with all wars, there are a lot of different positions that people can fill. All right, some people chose to dodge the draft. About 3% of those who were eligible escaped the draft. Some claimed that they had mental problems, they were married, right? So you could get a deferment, but that ended in 1965. Most of them who got a deferment, though, as I said, were in college. Some of them, I mean, it was true they needed to support their families. Also, if you were Section 8, you could claim that you were homosexual. Gays were not allowed in the military, and this was the case ever since World War I. What's interesting is in World War II. In World War I, a lot of people suffered from shell shock, and so they did psychological testing in World War II to see who was capable to deal with war. And then also with that, along with the psychological testing, they banned homosexuals from serving in the military. So when a lot of people were deployed and they're getting ready to ship off to World War II, they were asked questions or they were tested and somehow, I don't know how. And people who were gay were not deported. And so a lot of them were supposed to ship out to the Pacific from San Francisco, and they were denied. It's like, you can't go. So many of them ended up staying in San Francisco, and that became a hub for the homosexual community. But anyway, a lot of these people too, or some people too, went to Canada, so they were known as draft dodgers, right? Initially, they were looked down upon, they were cowards, they were unpatriotic. They were the scourge of society. But then prominent political figures come to find out they had done the same thing. Bill Clinton, he was at Oxford. Joe Biden didn't go. George H.W. Bush, he was in college at the time, even though he was a fighter pilot in a National Guard unit. I'm not sure what the thing was on Dick Cheney. He was George Bush's vice president. Okay, here are some numbers of the Vietnam War. The average age was 19, which was really young. In previous wars, it had been like in World War II, it was like 24. There were over 26 million, almost 27 men eligible for the draft, and about 15 million, over 15 million were deferred or exempted or disqualified. The total number who enlisted, here it says 1/3. Were almost 9 million, but the total number that were drafted were close to 2 million. All total, about 58,000 people were killed. All of those names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veteran War Memorial in Washington, D.C., but that doesn't count all those who were wounded, all those who suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome, or all the other ailments that come with having to endure war. If you look at it, it was a clear-cut victory for the United States. in terms of attrition because North Vietnam lost well over 1 million people, right? The United States uh, spent billions on this war, $24 billion, right, to aid the South Vietnamese government. This was from 55 to 75, so over the course of 20 years. Um, direct American expenditures, and which means all of our forces supplying them and everything else in our efforts, 165 billion, right? And if you look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, when he first took office in 1963 after Kennedy died, his approval rating was through the roof, right? But it continued to go down throughout his presidency, even though many people loved the Great Society, right? I remember my dad even saying he was a great president for the United States, but it was bad about his foreign policy in Vietnam. Of course, my dad spent 3 tours in Vietnam, so he was pretty biased. He didn't want to go back. All right, and if you look at here are the deaths in Vietnam. So when we started, you could say this was 1963, number 1, 64, number 2, 65, number 3, 66, number 4, 67, 68. Actually, it peaked in 68, so I have my years wrong. This is during Johnson's administration. So it would have been 64 is 0, 65 is 1, 66 is 2, 67 is 3, and 68 is 4. And then from there, we started to go down. So this is after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Even though when Kennedy was president, there were already 16,000 Americans serving in Vietnam. Okay, so here, and you can see the troops kind of climbing and escalating right there. They peaked in 1968. Johnson, he's not going to run for president anymore, and then Nixon becomes president, and then he starts to withdraw troops from Vietnam as soon as he takes office in 1969. And then this is Johnson's approval rating. You can see that it continues to decline as a result of the war in Vietnam. Just kind of look at that. Some of these things you may not know right now, but the bombing of Hanoi, the Tet Offensive, that was a real low point. That was in January of 1968. Okay, so he initiates the draft. Then, to ready everything for that, we do this air campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder. So the military always gives names to different operations, right? Let's see. D-Day, Operation Overlord, right? So I was involved in something when I was in the Army, and I have a certificate right here I'm going to show you. And it was where that you don't volunteer for anything in the Army. They just kind of make you do it. And one of the jobs that they made me do was urinalysis testing. You could get randomly tested while you were in the Army to see if you did drugs, and but somebody had to watch you pee to make sure that you actually went into the cup, and that was a job that I volunteered for, not really. So I got this certificate of appreciation. I don't know if you can read it or not. Here we go, right there. It's accommodation for me in Operation, are you ready? Golden Flow. I kid you not. So they named that. So this one was Operation Rolling Thunder. And what it did is it was an air campaign against North Vietnamese communist targets, right? Trying to get military targets, but they didn't have big ammunition bases or anything like that. Much of it was sent to them from China or from the Soviet Union. So the main target was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is outlined on this map in red. And what that was a supply line from the north down to the south. So the Viet Minh in the north were supplying the Viet Cong in the south with weaponry, right? So it wasn't like an interstate highway or anything like that. It was just a series of jungle paths through rivers and creeks and whatever you had. They do bicycle, whatever they had. So we were bombing that so that it wouldn't be an easy thoroughfare for them. But as soon as we would bomb, it kind of heightened their resolve and they would rebuild it, right? By 1967, we were dropping 800 tons of bombs a day. And look at this. Do you see at the top right? Here's an image. This is from present day Vietnam. Those are holes, craters still left from U.S. bombs that were dropped on North Vietnam. And then you can see here the guys in the bicycles in the creeks, they've got the supplies tied to their bicycles and they're going down the creeks to take this. That shows you right there their commitment. Also in the bottom right, here is an image, there's a carving on that tree to show this is the path, this is the way that you're supposed to go with the trail. Besides Operation Rolling Thunder, there was also an effort to find the enemy, but to find the enemy was difficult in Vietnam because of the vegetation there. It was easy for the enemy to hide in the vast, very dense forests of Vietnam. So the United States government used Agent Orange, which was a defoliant, an herbicide to kill the plants and also destroy the food supply and to demoralize the enemy. The only thing is we find out now that it's toxic. You know, it's like Roundup herbicide. So it was sprayed from the air like this on the people. One thing, we don't have definitive evidence because that's kind of hard to do, but there were higher cases of cancer as a result of this. Napalm was also used as ways of just kind of burning things and getting rid of the vegetation there. Okay, so once we had readied it, um, you know, the enemy, we had bombed them, we've tried to cut their supply line, their food supply, try to root them out of the jungle. Then it was also the ground war. Now keep in mind, we went to Vietnam under the assumption that we were going to free these people from the oppression of communism. So that was our goal. But I want you to think as we go through, do you believe that what we did made us look like we were freedom-loving people wanting to aid them, or were we becoming the oppressors? I think that sometimes the decisions that they made on the ground dictated how they functioned, but maybe if they could have stepped back and looked at it from a different perspective, it might have been different. Anyway, so North Vietnamese kept sending more troops to the south, right, because of these bombings. They were undeterred. They were committed, right? And then a lot of the people from the south became encouraged to join those in the north. So the Viet Cong forces were growing, which meant that we had more people to fight against. And it was an elusive enemy. We didn't know what they looked like because they weren't wearing uniforms, right? They wore something that to many Americans looked like pajamas, right? So anyway, we continued to increase our troops as they increased their troops. In 1965, the year after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, there were 185,000 troops, American troops in Vietnam. By 1967, 486,000. That number is going to climb almost another million, right? So General Westmoreland, he was the commander of all troops in Vietnam, right? And he oversaw that. And so he dictated what happened. So what do? You can't really fight on a major battlefield. So what you have to do is you have to go in and do these search and destroy missions. You have to find your enemy and then kill them, right? And their ability to strike you. I had a friend, actually, he was a sergeant, he was a pilot in my National Guard unit out of Decatur. When I got out of the Army, I joined this National Guard unit, the 106 Aviation. Um, Steve Hiles, and he was a Chief Warrant Officer 5. He flew in Vietnam. He was in Iraq. He was in the first Gulf War and Iraq. And in Vietnam, he said that what his job was is to fly a little 58, which is a little one-seater helicopter, over the treetops in Vietnam. And then he had to wait to see if he would get fired upon so that he could call in the grid coordinates so they would know when to set, where to send in airstrikes. So basically, he was trying to draw their fire so that they could go find them. And that was part of a search and destroy mission, right? Because otherwise you didn't know where your enemy was. They're in the jungle. They are in the mountains. They're in the villages. They're hidden out. So it was the job of our soldiers to go and find them. Even though they were told not to do this, one thing that they did is something called pacification or Zippo raids. Once you go into a village and you check to make sure that there are no Viet Cong there, then to make sure that no Viet Cong go there, some guys just decided what they were going to do is burn the village. This was called Zippo raids because they would take their Zippo lighters and then burn it down. Now, I ask you, does this win over the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people? Obviously not, right? These are their ancestral homes. And so the morale among our troops initially was high, but it was going down really low because they were wondering, who are we fighting and why are we fighting? And pretty soon they came to realize that they were just fighting to stay alive and fighting to help each other stay alive. They were fighting for their guys right there. The media played an important role in this war and in swaying public opinion. They were embedded within the troops and they showed images to the American people that contradicted what the American government was telling them. The American government was telling them, we're winning this war, we're killing way more of their soldiers than they are of ours, which was true, but the North Vietnamese were committed to their cause. This is an image from 1972 where this young girl, she was only 9 years old, she was escaping a napalm attack, and behind her are soldiers from South Vietnam. The napalm attack, many believed, was an attack by the U.S., which is not true. It was actually a South Vietnamese bomb that dropped the napalm. They were believing that the pilot believed that this was the enemy, the North Vietnamese on the ground, and so they hit the wrong target. So she runs off frantic. She now lives in Canada, right? She had left Vietnam and went to Canada. But anyway, so this really does turn the tide against the American people with the war. American deaths by 1967 are at 16,000. All right. Also, we start to see this growing anti-war movement. Initially, it was very, very small. Americans thought that they were doing the right thing and liberating the Vietnamese people from the oppressive communist government, right? They felt it's going to be very difficult to win this long, very protracted war so far away, right? So initially they supported it, but they started to withdraw their support. And you had two competing forces. You had hawks, people who supported the war, but they didn't like the way that it was being fought. And I have to admit, my father was one of those. He thought that these people in Washington, D.C. were conducting the war and they weren't letting those people on the ground win it. And to some extent, that might be true. Historians write about Lyndon Johnson's leadership style, that he got a lot of yes men around him, and he didn't listen to people who might have had a contradictory story as to what would be the right thing to do. And so these hawks believed that we were doing the wrong thing. Some of them believed that maybe we should use nuclear weapons, and that was suggested, right? Doves, who symbolize peace, they opposed the war. They were fearful of those nuclear weapons, and they believed that we were fighting against the wishes of the Vietnam people. So while there is a civil war going on in Vietnam, one is starting to take place here in the United States as well. All right, one of the leading anti-war demonstrators was a group called the Students for a Democratic Society. So these were young people on college campuses, right? It's ironic because these are rich kids who are in college who get the deferment, and they're protesting against a war that young people are fighting and dying for, people their own age in Vietnam. So there were 124 campuses in 1965 where riots broke out or protests broke out. Right? They held rallies, they held protests, they did sit-ins. They used some of the nonviolent techniques that were employed by the civil rights movement, right, and the women's movement. But anyway, they protested the military, they protested the draft, they protested the establishment, they protested the CIA that was on college campuses trying to recruit. And there's this huge rally, April 17th, 1965. This is just like a year and a half after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. 20,000 people go to the mall in Washington, D.C. to protest against the war. All right. Martin Luther King, as you know, he and other civil rights leaders protested it as well. They said that the money spent at the war, which is billions of dollars, what could be used for social reform and to aid Americans at home. So they were doing that. And this is one of the reasons why they lost some of their funding, because people thought that they were being unpatriotic, right? So they said, we're forced to support democracy abroad, but we're not enjoying it here. Plus, so many Black people were being drafted to serve in Vietnam. All right, last slide here. We do see that there are hearings in Congress about Vietnam that are being held. Johnson argued that they're trying to support an ally that is resisting communism, but others believe that that is not the case. Somebody within his own party, Senator William Fulbright, who was a dub, he held all these congressional hearings that were questioning what was going on there. The person in this image right here is former Senator John Kerry, who had run for president or against George W. Bush in 2004, and he lost. He went there and he was part of this anti-war movement during that time. Okay, next time we'll continue on with the war, and then the war's end. Thanks for listening. Bye.